Well, the bell hasn't rung yet, but I feel a lot of pressure on me to start. Fine. Okay. Real quick, I got an email a couple nights ago about regarding the Lake Forest Men's Day. It's coming up this coming Saturday at Lake Forest. I know there's a flyer on the bulletin board out here, and I know there's a sign-up list if you're going to ride the van. I know Toby's going to be driving the church van. But they were asking about count number. And so if you are going to ride the van, if you want to make sure that today you sign up on that list there. If you're not riding the van, but you think you may be going anyway, would you let me know? And that way I can kind of try to give them an estimate of a count because they're trying to think about food, lunch. So I just want to have that. So you can let me know, and I'll try to remember. And if I forget, I'll just make up a number and be like, yeah, we got 400 coming. Anyways, all right, Genesis is where we are. Sunday mornings, we'll be there for this quarter, going through the end of March, studying through the book of Genesis, and hopefully learning some things, maybe some things that we haven't noticed before or we didn't really know that might be beneficial to us and helpful to us as we study again this particular book that is at the very beginning of our Old Testament, the very beginning of things, right? We think about the creation of the world. We mentioned just a few minutes ago there in Genesis chapters 1 and 2, dealing with creation and the things of creation, and certainly what we learn about God. In fact, you might notice as we gave out the plan of work last week that our summer series is going to be focusing, or is going to be taken from the book of Genesis, but it's going to be lessons that are different than what we're studying here today. And what that is when we do our summer series, Genesis, as we think about this book of beginnings, and it's kind of our, if you're reading the Bible for the first time, you don't know anything about God, and you open up your Bible and you start in Genesis chapter 1 and verse 1, and you read through that book of Genesis. Genesis is kind of really our introduction to God and who He is. And there is a lot, when you think about it, if you just look at and concentrate on the book of Genesis, there's a lot that we learn about God just from this particular book, right? And so that's what our summer series is going to be geared towards, is looking at God and His nature and who He is, and studying those things that we learn about God, that we see about God from this book of Genesis. And so I'm excited about that. I think it'll be good this summer, and you'll have that there in the plan of work. You'll be able to see the different dates in July and August and each lesson and what the lesson will be about and what that lesson will be on. So just want to encourage you to think about that and make plans for that. Also, again, and I want to kind of keep putting in this plug because it's going to be here before we know it, but PTP Spark, we are hosting that in April, and you'll have that again in the plan of work. You'll be seeing things on it. In fact, we're kind of finalizing the brochure, the schedule for that, and so we'll be printing those out soon, and we'll be able to have those for you. You'll be able to look that over, but I encourage you to be a part of that, to make plans for that if you can. And we're excited about that event coming up. A lot of things going on. January has been a very busy month. Had Ladies' Day yesterday. I think that went really well. I was only involved in the food part. And when I say involved in the food part, that just means I took a ladle and I scooped chili in a bowl. That's what I do. That's what I'm best at. Anything else you don't really want me doing. So, but it was really good. I think I said at one point, I think I heard 105 or something like that as far as the count goes. So it seems like it went really well. And I heard a lot of great comments about it. I feel like I always do, but a lot of great comments about it from yesterday. And so we're appreciative of the ladies and everything that they did there. Genesis, we've been looking at last week. We were in the flood account, chapter 6 through 10. And we talked about the flood account, what the world was like and why God flooded the world, the earth. What about Noah and the fact that Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. And we even kind of tied that in, if you were here Wednesday night, in our study from Ephesians, because we were in Ephesians, and we've been looking at, among other things, in Ephesians, we talked about the subject of grace. And you see that tie-in when you look at what Paul says about grace in Ephesians 2, and you go back to Genesis 6, and you look at the first mentioning of the word or the idea of grace. And you see that there in Genesis chapter 6. And we understand what that means from the viewpoint of Noah. And I think when we go back and we look at Noah, again, remember, this is the beginnings, right? We're learning about God, and we learn about this idea of grace and tying it in with God. And when we look at the story of Noah, we kind of understand what grace means or what it is, right? Noah wasn't perfect. We know that because Romans 3 and verse 23 says that all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. So we know that he wasn't a perfect man, although he was a good man. He was a righteous man trying to do right, trying to live right. And he was far different than everybody else that was living during that time, who were only thinking about evil continually. But still, when it comes to Noah, what we know about him is that because Noah was trying to do what was right, God, when he was going to flood the earth, he decided that he was going to tell Noah about his plans, what he was going to do, but also he was going to provide a way for Noah and his family to be saved. And that's really what grace is about. It's about God warning us of sin and its consequences, but providing for us a way of salvation, a way out of sin, an escape from that. And so that's what Ephesians 2 talks about, being saved by grace, right? And we can't boast, we can't brag about ourselves, we can't say that we earned it or we deserved it or, I really climbed my way out of that mess. No. What God did for us, because of His gracious gift, it was something that we could not do for ourselves. And so we learned that through Noah, and I think Noah's a good example of that. But we move on into chapter, this morning, we're going to look at chapters 11 through 14. I feel like I've kept a little better pace than I do in Ephesians, which we'll be trying to look at basically the last 3 chapters this coming Wednesday night. But here in Genesis chapter 11, a story that we begin with that we're kind of familiar with, right? But I think some things that we want to notice here about the Tower of Babel. Notice there, Genesis chapter 11, I want to begin in verse 1 and read through verse 9 as we begin this. It says, now all the earth used the same language and the same words, right? It makes sense. I mean, especially coming off the ark, there was Noah and his family, and they began to reproduce, and obviously they're coming from all that one family of Noah, and of course populating the earth once again. So it makes sense that they all had the same language, right? All spoke the same words. And it came about as they journeyed east. Now, here was something that's interesting that I had never thought about before, but it had kind of been pointed out to me. And you'll notice this at least twice in our story today, maybe 3 times, I can't remember. But anytime that when you read in Genesis where they journeyed east, most of the time when they journeyed east, that didn't mean good things, that meant bad things. And you'll see it, I'll point it out again here in a moment, and you'll see what I'm talking about. But it came about as they journeyed east, that they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. Then they said to one another, come, let us make bricks and fire them thoroughly. And they used brick for stone, and they used tar for mortar. And they said, come, let's build ourselves a city and a tower whose top will reach into heaven. And let's make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we will be scattered abroad over the face of all the earth. So notice what they wanted to do. The Bible says that they wanted to make a name for themselves, okay? But they also wanted to keep from being scattered all over the face of the earth. Now, verse 5. The Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the men had built. And the Lord said, behold, they are one people, and they all have the same language. And this is what they have started to do. And now nothing which they plan to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down there and confuse their language, so they will not understand one another's speech. So the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of all the earth, and they stopped building the city. Therefore it was named Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth, and from there the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of all the earth. So notice here, as we look at this, some things I want to kind of point out to us that I think is important for us to think about and maybe kind of consider together. They wanted to build this because they wanted to create or make a name for themselves, right? And when you think about this, they sought a name there in verse 4, but they ended with confusion. They didn't want to be scattered. That was another thing that it points out there in verse 4. But yet God scatters them. And then they left all the land, right, to avoid all the land, but God scattered them into all the land. So this is kind of what you see, what happens here. You know, man has a plan, right? Man says, this is what we're going to do. God says, no, that's not what you're going to do. And so what we see here is we see, of course, something that I think we can learn from in this and some lessons, I think. Number one, again, and we kind of see this repeated in the New Testament, for example, in James chapter 4. We can make plans, right? We can say, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. But what we learn is that what we need to say is, if the Lord wills, I'll do this. If the Lord wills, I'll do that, right? And obviously they weren't bringing God into consideration into what they were doing. What they were doing was for themselves. Let's make a name for ourselves, right? So that's what they were wanting to do. But I think also here's something that I noticed about this story. I think it's important for us today, and especially as the church. They got together. They were all speaking the same language. They were all saying the same words, the Bible says. They said, here's what we're going to do. They were unified in their purpose and all of that, right? But notice what God says in verse 6. The Lord said, behold, they are one people, and they all have the same language, right? This is what they've started to do. Now watch what he says next. And this is very interesting coming from God. And now nothing which they plan to do will be impossible for them. So think about what God is saying here. He's saying, here's this group of people that is, they're unified. They all speak the same language, the same words. They all have the same purpose. They're all working towards the same goal. And because of that, he says there's nothing now that will be impossible for them to do. In other words, what God is kind of saying here is, sky's the limit. But I want you to notice this, and I think what you and I can take from this and what we can use today. Think about, maybe sometimes as the church, or maybe we think of ourselves individually rather than maybe always collectively as the church, but I want us to consider ourselves together as the church, right? Have you ever thought about the church and maybe you looked at the world and you say, what good are we going to do in the world today? What difference can we make in the world today? You ever been tempted to think that? You look at the state of the world, let's just kind of boil it down to the country that we live in. And we look at some of the things that are happening in our country and we think to ourselves, what good can we do? How much can we really accomplish? It seems like the forces of evil are greater than the forces of good. It seems like there's more people that are interested in doing wrong and doing bad and don't care about God. And so what really can we do? What difference can we make? But notice what God says here. Here was a people that all spoke the same language, same words, right? They were unified in what they said. Can you and I be unified in what we say? Now, I'm not talking about, do you speak, Spanish better than English or something like that, right? I mean, but think about it. When we talk about the words that we speak, the language that we speak, what is it that you and I should be proclaiming in this world? The gospel, right? Right? We should be telling others about Jesus. We should be telling others about the God that we serve. Okay? So we should have the same language, right? We should be speaking the same words. Okay? We should be unified in that way. We should have the same message that we're carrying out to everyone, right? Because it doesn't matter who we come in contact with in the world, everyone needs the gospel. Everyone needs salvation, right? It doesn't matter who you are, where you came from, or what your background is, or how you were raised, or any of those things. Everybody needs the gospel. And it's the same message, right? It's one message. We've been studying on Wednesday nights Ephesians, and we just got through this past Wednesday night, Ephesians chapter 4, the 7 ones. Remember, he begins in verses 1 through 3, and one of the things that Paul talks about is being unified. And one of the things that they were unified around is what they were believing in, right? What were the contents of their faith? And so, things like one Lord and one baptism and one body, one faith, right? One God, all of those things. And so the unification. So you and I should be unified in that we're speaking the same thing. We're proclaiming the same message to all of those who would have need. Okay? But then, notice he says there that because they were unified, right? Unified in language, but also unified in purpose, weren't they? They all had the same goal. They were working towards the same end, weren't they? If you and I are unified, not just in our message that we speak and proclaim, but in our goals and what is our end, right? If we're unified in that, we all have the same purpose. If we're unified in those two things, then could God not say about us? Could the world not say about us the same thing that God says here about these people? Now nothing which they plan to do will be impossible for them. Think about that. Sometimes I'm afraid maybe we don't do as much as we can because in our minds we think, well, what good is it going to do? Am I really going to make a difference? Can we really do good in the world today? When I go back to Genesis 11 and I read this story about the Tower of Babel, what I see that when you take people who God has created, right, and you unify them, You give them the same message, the same language, right? They're all speaking the same thing. They have the same purpose. They're moving towards the same goal, the same end. When you do that, you unify them. According to the words of God, there's nothing that will be impossible for them. And so I ask that question again. Can you and I make a difference in the world today? Yes, we can. If we as a unified body of Christ will go out there and we speak the same message, the same language, the same words, and we're unified in our purpose and what we're trying to do, then yes, absolutely, we can make a difference in this world. In fact, I would say that Satan would not be well pleased about it because, what he wants is he wants us to be scattered, right? He wants us to not be unified. He wants us to not speak the same language. He wants us not to have the same purpose and the same end in mind. Or he wants us to doubt what we're able to do. When I go back and I read this story, I only see what God is saying here, and the saying that, look, if we're unified in all these things, there's a lot of good we can accomplish in this world. So I want to encourage all of us to not think in the negative term about maybe what's going to be hard or what seems like is impossible, but let's think in a positive way. Look, what can we do? If we're all unified together, right? If we're all working together towards the same goal and the same end, how much can we really accomplish? There's a lot of good that you and I can do in this world. And think about it, if every congregation of the Lord's people thought the same way, everywhere, right? It's not like we're the only church in the United States of America, right? If all of the congregations of the Lord's church everywhere thought the same way and went out and spoke the same message and had the same purpose to the same end, and they did that, think about the difference we really would and could make in the world today. So I want to encourage you as you read that to take that with you and let that be something that you and I look at and say, yeah, that's exactly right. That's something that you and I can do if we're willing to do that. And so any questions, any comments about that right there, about what we just talked about or mentioned there before we move on? No? Okay. The rest of this chapter kind of deals with, we get to the genealogies and we're kind of like, genealogies. And maybe we're tempted to skip it, but I want us to make sure that we get at least the end of this. As you go through there, the descendants of Shem is what we see in verse 10. But that's bringing us all to, when you get down to about verse 27, 26, 27, Terah, who is the father of a man by the name of Abram, right? And Abram is an important character we're going to see here, we already know about. But when you look at Abram there, you'll see that the Bible tells us that native land was Ur of the Chaldeans. Verse 29, Abram and Nahor took wives for themselves. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai. And then down in verse 30, Sarai was unable to conceive, and she did not have a child, right? That's an important notice of what we're going to see. Now, Terah took his son Abram and Lot, the son of Haran, his grandson, and his daughter-in-law Sarah and his son Abram's wife, and they departed together from Ur of the Chaldeans to go to the land of Canaan. And they went as far as Haran and settled there. So they were going to Canaan. They had left Ur, where they were originally from, but they didn't quite make it. They stopped in a place and they kind of settled down in a place called Haran. Now, if you were with us a few months ago, I was on Wednesday night, we did a class on Bible geography. And we did that class, we kind of noted, because we looked at the journey of Abraham and kind of where he started, where he went. He started in Ur, that was where he originally from, kind of like that's where he was born, right? Born and raised. But then he was moved with his father to this place called Haran. That wasn't quite in Canaan, but it was kind of going towards that direction. And then when you flip over to chapter 12, here's what you see as it begins. Now the Lord said to Abram, right? This is the promise that God is going to make to Abram. And this is important because this really launches us out into the rest of the Bible and the purpose that God had with His Son Jesus Christ. Now the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and from your relatives and from your father's house to the land which I will show you. And I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. And I will make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse. And in you all, the families of the earth will be blessed. So here God makes this promise to Abram, right? And the promise we oftentimes look at really threefold, but maybe even more than that. But there's a promise that from Abram, he is going to make him a great nation, right? Now remember, the Bible has already told us that his wife, Sarai, she was unable to conceive. Okay, we're going to see in a moment that Abram, when he gets this blessing and he moves, he's 75 years old. Okay? Now, I don't want to embarrass anybody. You don't have to raise your hand. Okay? But if you are around the age of 75, would you raise your hand? You don't have to. I'm not going to make you, right? I'm not going to, okay. Yeah, Bruce. Okay, George. All right. Okay, got some folks around here. Okay. Right? 75. Okay? Now, I'm not saying that, but what if, right, you had this command from the Lord to move, right? You're going to move your whole family, okay? That you might say, well, I can do it. It's not going to be easy, but I can do that, right? But what if God said, hey, I'm going to make a great nation out of you, and you didn't have any kids? At 75, what would you think about that? If you were 75 years old, you had no kids, and God said, I'm going to make a great nation out of you, what would you think? Okay, Bruce is Abram. All right, let's do it. Okay, all right. We would think about that, and we would think, I don't know, right? That's what he said. Okay, and through your offspring, right? All nations are going to be blessed. There's going to be something special about that. Aaron, you're not 75, buddy. No, I'm kidding. Go ahead, Aaron.
Although I feel it sometimes. So you have to, I think, no insult to you here, but I think you have to put it into perspective. When people were living to be 700 to 900 years, 75 was just technically infancy in comparison. So,
well, Abram didn't live that long. They were already, we had already taken, and you're right, but they had already taken the ages down. Like we're already kind of.
That had already happened?
Yes, that after the flood.
Never mind.
But 75, as far as we know the story goes, right, because we have some information here, but also in Hebrews, for example, that as far as Abram and Sarah were concerned, they were well past the childbearing ages, right? Now, yeah, you're right. When people lived to 800-900 years old, there was a lot more of that. We've kind of gotten to where we sort of have crunched down the ages a little bit more here. And, hey, there's going to be this great blessing, right? And obviously we're looking at eventually Jesus coming into the world. And there's this land promise, right, where, okay, I'm going to give you this land, right? If I'm going to make a great nation out of you, I got to give you a place to live. So God says, I'm also going to do that for you as well. In fact, I want you, Abram, right now to go ahead, and I want you to go ahead and move your family there now, right? So he does that, okay? He moves his family there. In other words, he believes God's promise, right? There's nothing here initially that indicates that Abram says, all right, whatever you say. But no, he does it, doesn't he? He does exactly what God asked him to do. He goes and he journeys. Of course, the Bible says he takes Lot with him as well. We see in verse, I think it's 4, that he was 75 years old when he left. And they take all their possessions, and they travel to this particular land. He builds an altar there. He stops in Bethel. He sets up his tent there, so that's kind of the land that he's in. Now, there's a famine that comes out, okay? And a lot of times we see it in Old Testament times. There's famines, and whenever a famine comes about, right, that means that food is very scarce. And so, what do you naturally do during that time? You go to where food is, right? I mean, you're naturally just, okay, well, if there's no food here, I'm going to go to where there's food. It's kind of like, and I can only imagine all these people that are, in danger of this winter storm, right? Everybody bought all the bread and the milk. So if you go to the Walmart and there's no bread and there's no milk, what are you going to do? I'm going to the next store, right? I'm going to go to the Winn-Dixie, or I'm going to go to the Publix, I'm going to go to the Target, I'm going to go to the next town over. I'm going to do whatever I need to do, but I'm going to go where the food is. Or if I know my neighbor brought 6 loaves of bread, I'm just going to his house. We're going to hang out there. But that's what you do, right? That's what they did. They go to Egypt. But here's what happens. Verse 10, there's a famine in the land, so Abram went down to Egypt to live there for a time, okay, because the famine was severe in the land. It came about when he was approaching Egypt that he said to his wife, Sarah, see now, I know that you are a beautiful woman. Thanks, Abram. Boy, I appreciate that. All you that raise your hand that you're about 75, ladies, your husband finally tell you at 75, hey, you know what I just figured out? You're pretty. And I'm not the only one that thinks that. So he says this to her, verse 12. And when the Egyptians see you, they will say, because he's like, I'm a guy, I know how guys think, right? This is his wife. And they will kill me, but they'll let you live. Please say that you are my sister, so that it may go well for me because of you, and that I may live on account of you. So in other words, what is Abram doing here? Well, yeah, I mean, now there is sort of this thing in the ancient Near East, and we would kind of call it the wife-sister motif. In other words, there were times where, and this is a factual thing in ancient Near Eastern, where individuals referred to, other women as their sisters, even if they weren't their sisters. Like sometimes a wife, even considered. I've gone to take a wife of my sisters, and you might think, oh, that's incest. Well, then when you start to study it, wait a second, they weren't actually. That wasn't actually that person's sister. They just called that woman sister. Okay, kind of like we might do in the church, right? We call our fellow Christians, we call the ladies sisters, right? And if you were in a church circle and you said, "Hey, I married my sister," people would be like, "Whoa," and you say, "No, sister in Christ." Oh, okay, yeah. So there was a thing in the ancient Near East where there was this sort of, sister wife. So I think maybe in Abram's mind, he thinks, well, technically, I can say this and get away with it, right? I mean, it might have been something that would have been accepted, but we see what happens next, right? Because when he gets there, verse 14, when Abram entered Egypt, the Egyptians saw that the woman was very beautiful, right? Just as Abram had suspected. Pharaoh's officials saw her and praised her to Pharaoh. In other words, they go to Pharaoh and say, Pharaoh, there's this new couple that just rolled into town, and man, this woman is beautiful. You gotta see her, you gotta meet her. So she's taken to Pharaoh's house, and therefore he treated Abram well for her sake. And he gave him sheep and oxen and male donkeys and male servants and female donkeys and camels. I mean, he's just like, giving them all these gifts. But verse 17, but the Lord struck Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abram's wife. Then Pharaoh called Abram. So this is kind of the first time that Egypt was struck with plagues. Not the last, but it was the first time, right? What is it that you have done to me? Why did you not tell me that she was your wife? In other words, yeah, you said she was my sister, but you could have clarified, right? Why did you say she's my sister so that now I took her for myself as a wife? Now then, here is your wife, take her and go. In other words, get out of here. I'm not trying to have all these plagues that you're bringing upon me for what you're doing, right? So God was protecting Abram and Sarai and their relationship, but also the fact that, remember, she's barren, but she's eventually going to have a child. And let it not be said that her child that was going to come through her was going to come of someone else, right? It was going to be God that was going to be making sure this happened. And so he does that, and of course, Pharaoh says, get out of here. And so, verse 20, Pharaoh commanded his men concerning him. They escorted him away with his wife and all that belonged to him. In other words, you see that man to the door. I don't want him. He's bringing me trouble. And so, here's this. And by the way, it's the first time and not the last time that this will happen with Abram and with Sarah as well. Now, we also know, because we also kind of question this, but Sarah was technically, when you go on to chapter 20 and verse 12, she was technically the half-sister of Abraham, wasn't she? So, yeah. By the way, I mentioned there, the term sister. It doesn't always mean a blood relationship. In Song of Solomon, chapter 4, verses 9 through 12, and also chapter 5, verse 1, we see this phrase, my sister, my bride. And again, that was because there were times where that was the word that was used to refer it, even though there was not a blood relationship between this person and his bride, who he was going to marry, or here in this case, Abram and Sarah, although she was a half sister at this time as well, right? Okay, so we get to chapter 13, and here is where we read about Abram and Lot. Now remember, Lot is Abram's nephew. He has brought him with him when he left Haran, when God made this promise and took him out and all that, right? So he's a part of Abram's family. He's an important part of Abram's family. But in chapter 13, verse 1, Abram went up from Egypt to the Negev, and he and his wife and all that belonged to him, and Lot with him. Now, Abram was very rich in livestock. In other words, God had blessed him, right? He was rich in livestock, silver, and gold. And he went on his journeys from the Negev as far as Bethel to the place where his tent had been at the beginning between Bethel and Ai. So he goes back to where he was before, the place of the altar, right? Where he called on the name of the Lord. And Lot, who went with Abram, he also had flocks and herds and tents. And the land could not support both of them while living together, for their possessions were so great that they were not able to remain together, right? There was too much like livestock and all that, just not enough room for all of them. And there was strife between the herdsmen of Abram's livestock, the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. Now the Canaanites and the Perizzites were living in the land at that time. So what happens? Well, Abram comes to Lot and he says in verse 9, please let there be no strife between you and me. He's trying to be a peacemaker, nor between my herdsmen and your herdsmen, for we are relatives. We're family. We shouldn't be doing this, right? So he says, there is the entire land not before you. Please separate from me. If you choose the left, then I will go to the right. If you choose the right, I will go to the left. In other words, you got first choice. You choose what you want, and I'll just take whatever you don't choose. So for Abram, he could have been the opposite, right? I mean, there's a lot of reasons why Abram could have said, I'll make the decision and you'll go where I tell you. First of all, I'm your uncle, you're my nephew. Second of all, God's blessed me, God's made this promise to me, all this. But he doesn't do that, does he? He says, you choose, I'll let you pick. And so he says there, verse 10, Lot raised his eyes and saw all the vicinity of the Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt going towards Zoar. So in other words, go all the way back to the garden of the Lord in the very beginning in chapter 2. It was a well-watered garden, right? So Lot chose for himself all the vicinity of the Jordan, and Lot journeyed where? Verse 11. Where? East. What did we just say about going east? Yeah. And it's interesting because I never knew that before, but if you go back through the book of Genesis and you look, a lot of times where you see that when they went east, it really wasn't a good thing. It was actually a bad thing. So here, the Bible tells us that Lot journeys east, right? And he goes, so it says they separated from one another. Abram settled in the land of Canaan, while Lot settled in the cities of the vicinity of the Jordan and moved his tents as far as Sodom. Now, notice verse 13. Now the men of Sodom were exceedingly wicked sinners against the Lord. So now this is our first introduction to Sodom, right? And what does it say about Sodom, about the men of Sodom? Well, they weren't just wicked. They were exceedingly wicked, right? I mean, these people were evil, okay? These are some bad people. So they were already probably on God's radar, right, as far as all that goes. So we're going to see more about that as we move forward. But I want you to notice that, a lot of times when we talk about Sodom and Gomorrah, and we'll get to the destruction of those when we move forward in chapter 19. But a lot of times when we think about that city, our minds zero in on one particular sin, right? But I want you to appreciate the fact that it wasn't just one sin. There was a whole host of sins that they were involved in. Now, there was certainly a sin that was a part of that, and we'll get to that. But these men were exceedingly wicked. They weren't just a little bit, they weren't just, well, they struggle in this area, or they just had this one thing. No, it was the totality of their wickedness, of their evil, right? And so this is what the reputation was. And so we talk about moving east, right? It's not just about the land itself. The land was good. And that's the reason why Lot chose the land, because it was the land was well watered. In other words, the grass was green, it was nice, it was beautiful. Things grew there. And so he saw that, and that's what he wanted. And so he went there. But there was a price to be paid for that, wasn't there? And the fact that, yes, the land itself was nice, but the people, could have done a whole lot better. And so the Bible tells us about these people there. So verse 14, the Lord said to Abram after Lot had separated from him, now raise your eyes and look from the place where you are, north, south, east, west. For all the land that you see, I will give to you and to your descendants forever. And I will make your descendants as plentiful as the dust of the earth, so that if anyone can count the dust of the earth, then your descendants could also be counted. Arise, walk about in the land through its length and its width, for I will give it to you. And Abram moved his tent and came and lived by the oaks of Mamre, which are in Hebron. And there he built an altar to the Lord. So God once again tells Abram, okay, I want you to see where you are. He's in the land of Canaan. I want you to look north. I want you to look south. I want you to look west. I want you to look east. Everywhere you can see, as far as your eye can see, all of this is going to be yours, right? Now, you kind of take that to today. If you're looking for a place to live, you know, maybe you need a realtor and you go and you look at a place, right? When you go, you say, I want you to look. All right, don't look as far as your eye can see. Just look about right there. Look about right there, about right there, and about right there. That's what you get, right? Okay? That's all you're getting. That wasn't Abram. God said, I want you to look as far as you can see, everywhere, every direction you look around you, and all of this is going to be yours. And you're going to need this much land because your descendants are going to be so many that they're going to be as the grains of the earth, of the sands. And so he says, if someone can number all that, they'll be able to number your descendants. And so this is, again, going back to doubling down on the promise that God had already made to him. Okay? Any questions, any comments before we get to chapter 14? We've got about 10 minutes left. We're decent pace today. Decent pace. No? Okay. Chapter 14. Came about in the, and this is, by the way, I read this and I think to myself, some of these words, I don't know. You be the judge. Maybe you took Hebrew or something. Maybe you know how to pronounce these words better than I do. You might. There's a few words in here like salt I can pronounce good. All the other ones I'm just guessing, so bear with me. The days of Amraphel, king of Shinar, Arioch, king of Elasar, Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, Tidal, king of Goim. That they made war with Bera, king of Sodom, with Birsha, king of Gomorrah, Shinab, king of Admah, and Shemember, king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, right? So in other words, there was this great war. Well, as a casualty of war, you might say there, the Bible tells us, we'll skip down to about verse 10. Now the valley of Siddim was full of tar pits, and the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled, and they fell into them. But those who survived fled to the hill country. Then they took all the possessions of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their food supply and departed. They also took Lot, Abram's nephew, and his possessions and departed, for he was living in Sodom. So this was a war that was going on between these kings. There was 5 kings versus 4 kings. The problem is that whenever something like this happens, there are what we oftentimes call casualties of war, right? People that are maybe not involved in the war, but they suffer as a result. Well, because of this defeat now, not only do they take the food and the supplies and all that, but the Bible says they take Lot, okay? And his possessions, and they left. Well, verse 13, then a survivor comes and tells Abraham. Now he was residing by the oaks of Mamre, the Amorite, brother of Eshcol and brother of Aner, and they were all together, or they were allies rather, with Abram. So he'd already made friends and had these people that were allies. When Abram heard that his relative had been taken captive, he led out his trained men born in his house, numbering 318, and went in pursuit as far as Dan. So notice this. Abram who was born in his own house, he has 318 trained men. Now, these weren't his sons, obviously, right? Because he didn't have any children, but they were growing up in his household. And these were 318 of his own sort of trained men. So if anything ever happened or went down, he had his own little small army, so to speak, right? Okay, now, obviously he's hoping nothing ever happens, but in this case, something does happen. And it gets back to him that, yes, there's this war, this battle going on. It had nothing to do with Abram, but now he's involved because his nephew Lot has been taken captive. And so he gets these 318 men, the men that he had also allied himself with. And it says he goes in pursuit as far as Dan. Then he divided his forces against them by night, he and his servants, and defeated them and pursued them as far as Hobah, which is in north of Damascus. And he brought back all the possessions and also brought back his relative Lot with his possessions and also the women and the other people. Now, the Bible doesn't tell us this, but I would imagine that the forces that Abram was going against were far greater in number than the ones that he had. I don't think these kings and their forces were only about 320, right? You would imagine there was a lot more. But Abram used strategy, right? There was a strategy involved at night. They're dividing the forces, but also, obviously, God was with him. And so he was successful. And by the way, his purpose in doing that was simply to bring back not just the possessions, but also his relative Lot and his possessions, right? And that was what he was wanting to do. And so that's exactly what he was successful in doing. Now, as we get to this very last part of chapter 14, I want us to notice, because this kind of ties in with the study we did towards the end of last year in Hebrews. Very interesting here that we see this. But in verse 17, it says, "Then after his return from the defeat of Chedorlaomer and the kings who were with him, the king of Sodom went out to meet him at the valley of Shaveh," which is the king's valley. "And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. Now he was a priest of God Most High." So here is this Melchizedek that we read about here in Genesis chapter 14. And we don't read about this Melchizedek. Well, I think it's mentioned in Psalms, but then we don't see him again until all the way in Hebrews. Okay, and if you studied Hebrews with us, you know the tie-in there, and we'll talk about that here a little bit. But the idea of him being both priest and king. He was the king of Salem, so he was a king, okay? But he was also, the Bible says, a priest of God Most High. Now, yes, the promise had been made to Abram already, chapter 12. But are we prior to, are we before or after the giving of the law of Moses? We're prior to, right? Obviously, okay? So before, right, and we know the law of Moses had a lot of laws regarding priest, and the priest had to be from the tribe of Levi, had to be a Levite, and things concerning what the priest would do and all that, right? But there was, at least here we see in Genesis 14, there were priests who existed before, prior to the law of Moses. Here is one of them. His name is Melchizedek. He's a king, but also a priest, which makes him very unique, right? Because you probably won't find anybody else moving forward who the Bible would say, okay, this person was a priest, but they were also a king. So he's a king of Salem. He's also a priest. And he comes to Abram, and he says in verse 19, he blessed him, saying, "Blessed be Abram of God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has handed over your enemies to you." What does this priest identify about Abram's victory? Gave the credit to God, didn't he? Right? God's the reason for this. And so not only is he praising Abram, but he's also praising God. But notice what he does here. You know, when he says there, "Blessed be Abram of God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth." Remember one of the promises we saw in Genesis 12, one of the things that God promised, we don't often concentrate on, but he told Abram he was going to do what to his name? Make his name great, right? Here's a king and a priest who comes and blesses Abram. So I think this is a fulfillment, or at least in part of that promise that God made to give Abraham, or to make his name great. Okay? And he gave him, verse 20 at the end, he gave him a tenth of everything. Then the king of Sodom said to Abram, "Give the people to me and take the possessions for yourself." In other words, appreciate what you've done, and I'd like to do this for you as payment. But Abram said to the king of Sodom, "I have sworn to the Lord God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, that I will not take a thread or a sandal strap or anything that is yours, so that you do not say, 'I've made Abram rich.' I will take nothing except what the young men have eaten, and the share of the men who went with me, Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre. Let them take their share." So what did Abram say that he did here? He had done what? He had made a what? He made a what? A promise, right? To God? What does that tell you? Before Abram went into battle to rescue Lot, what do you think Abram did? Did he not entreat God? Did he not probably ask God for God's help, God's blessing, right? And it says, "Lord, you give me victory, and I'm not going to take any of these possessions. Here's what I'm going to do." In other words, he had thought this out. He had a plan, but his plan was not to enrich himself or to make himself rich off of all that he would get back. He said, "No, I just want to make sure everybody's brought back safely and all their possessions." And so he identifies that he did this when he says all of this, right? So I think that speaks volumes of Abram and who he is, and also the fact that obviously God was involved in this, because Abraham obviously had talked to God about this before this ever happened. And I think it's important for us to kind of note here. Now, again, going back to Melchizedek, this priest, this king, he gives a tenth, he tithes, so to speak, to Abram. When you get to the book of Hebrews, the Bible talks about Christ as being that forever high priest. And people might have a problem and say, well, Jesus, he can't be a priest because he's not a Levite. He was from the tribe of Judah, and you know that the law does not permit someone of the tribe of Judah to be a priest. Well, the Hebrews' answer to that is that, there was this fella, and he predated the law of Moses, which, by the way, Christ did as well. But he was also a priest. Not only was he a priest, but he was also a king, just like Jesus. And Jesus, as a high priest, he's a high priest not after the Levitical order, but rather after the order of Melchizedek. This man that we read about here in Genesis chapter 14. This man who is mentioned in just a very few verses. It seems like here's what happens, and then you go on through Genesis and you never read about this Melchizedek again. He's kind of forgotten about. Again, you see something in Psalms about him, but then when you get to Hebrews, all of a sudden, boom, the Hebrew writer goes back and he uses this Melchizedek, and he says, for those who have a problem with Jesus as a high priest, I need you to go back to Genesis 14 and read about this Melchizedek, and now you'll understand how Jesus can be a priest. He's a priest after the order of Melchizedek, not after the Levitical order. So that wraps up chapter 14. We'll pick up next week. Thank you for your attention. Have a good lunch.